While Jamal spoke, across town in the police department's main headquarters, Chief Morales stood at a podium flanked by city officials. The press conference had been called after an internal review concluded, and the findings were grim. Riley's record revealed a pattern of questionable stops and arrests, many of which had already drawn internal complaints that had been quietly closed without resolution. Effective immediately, Riley's badge and service weapon were taken, his termination announced in front of the cameras. Jenkins, who had chosen to cooperate fully with the investigation, stepped forward later in the day to give his own statement. In a voice heavy with regret, he admitted that he had followed orders instead of his conscience, and that his silence had allowed injustice to happen. It was not a speech to absolve himself, but one to acknowledge the truth. His testimony had been pivotal in exposing the flaws in Darnell's and Jamal's arrests. Morales confirmed that Jenkins had resigned from the force voluntarily, but would be assisting as a civilian in community outreach programs designed to bridge trust between officers and the neighborhoods they served. The reforms began to move quickly. Under pressure from both public outrage and political will, the City Council passed a sweeping accountability measure named the West Carter Justice Reform Act. It required stricter protocols for stops based on descriptions, mandatory release within a set time frame if probable cause could not be established, expanded access to body camera footage, and an independent civilian review board with real authority to investigate misconduct. The law was hailed as one of the most comprehensive police accountability measures in the nation. Weeks later, Jamal found himself back where it had all started, walking down the same street where Riley and Jenkins had first approached him. A diner owner stepped outside, waving as he passed, and a few strangers stopped to shake his hand, their thanks sincere. He paused for a moment, looking toward the spot where he had stood with his car keys in one hand and a vague accusation hanging over his head. That day had changed him, not by making him a victim, but by sharpening his understanding of how quickly injustice could come for anyone. That evening, he stood in the community center his organization had helped build, speaking to a group of young men and women. He told them not about his own arrest, but about the power of knowing their rights, the strength in standing together, and the responsibility of holding every institution accountable to the people it served. His voice was steady, but his words carried the weight of lived truth. In the back of the room, Angela watched him with quiet pride. She had seen her son fight in courtrooms before, but this was different. This was not just about winning cases, it was about reshaping the system itself. When the event ended and the chairs began to scrape against the floor, Jamal lingered for a moment, looking out through the tall windows into the night beyond. The city lights glimmered like a constellation spread across the streets, each one a reminder that there were still battles to be fought, still stories to be told, still lives to be defended. And he knew, with the same certainty he had felt in that holding cell, that he would be there, not just to fight them, but to win. Monumental change. The courtroom was full long before the hearing began. Rows of wooden benches were lined with reporters, activists, and ordinary citizens who had come to witness what many were calling a defining moment for the city. The air carried a charged silence, not the absence of sound, but the tight, waiting stillness that comes before something irreversible. On one side sat Darnell Carter, dressed in a neatly pressed shirt provided by his mother that morning, his shoulders squared though his hands trembled slightly in his lap. Behind him, Angela West placed a reassuring hand on his back, her presence a steady anchor in the storm. On the other side, the city's prosecuting attorney shifted uneasily through his papers, acutely aware that the cameras positioned in the back corners were streaming every detail to a public eager for justice. Jamal West entered quietly, but with the same unshakable composure that had carried him through every step of this journey. The whispers began the moment he stepped through the double doors, spreading down the rows like a current. He wasn't just a lawyer in this case. He was the man whose own wrongful arrest had set this chain of events in motion. Every move he made was deliberate, from the way he placed his briefcase on the table to the moment he met Darnell's eyes with a steady, silent nod that said, "We're going to win this." When the judge took the bench, the gavel's sharp crack cut through the air. The proceedings moved quickly at first, the defense presenting body camera footage, inconsistencies in the arrest timeline, and the absence of any credible eyewitness testimony. Jamal spoke with a precision that seemed to weigh each word before releasing it, his voice neither theatrical nor subdued, just clear, undeniable truth. He laid out the facts, showing how Riley's report conflicted with dispatch logs, how Jenkins's tests his. Timony hinted at doubts from the very beginning, and how Darnell had been held far longer than the law allowed without a shred of evidence tying him to the crime. By the time he finished, the prosecuting attorney could only offer a weary acknowledgement that the state no longer had grounds to proceed. The judge's decision was swift. The charges against Mr. Carter are dismissed. He is free to go. The room erupted. Darnell's mother covered her face with her hands, sobbing into them as Angela pulled her into a firm embrace. Darnell turned to Jamal, disbelief breaking into a wide, unrestrained smile. For a moment, the noise in the room blurred into the background for Jamal, replaced by the steady beat of something deeper, the reminder of why he had chosen this path in the first place. But the victory in that courtroom was only the first strike of the day. Outside on the courthouse steps, Jamal addressed a crowd that had swelled far beyond the press. There were people holding signs with Darnell's name, others with slogans calling for reform, and even a few bearing photographs of loved ones they claimed had been victims of the same unjust practices. Marcus stood to the side with his camera, capturing every word. "This is not the end," Jamal said, his voice carrying over the restless hum of the street. "This is proof that change is possible when we refuse to be silent, but it's also proof that without vigilance, the same injustice can happen again tomorrow, to someone else, in some other corner of this city. We cannot allow this to fade into just another headline. We must demand better, and we will." The plan moved quickly. Within hours, Marcus had arranged an interview with Darnell's mother, a soft-spoken woman who worked double shifts as a nurse's aide and hadn't missed a single court date. The interview aired that evening, her voice trembling as she described the night her son was taken away, the fear she saw in his eyes, and the emptiness in her apartment since. Jamal appeared alongside her, not as a victim of his own recent arrest, but as an advocate determined to make sure no one else went through the same ordeal. Meanwhile, Chief Morales convened a closed-door meeting at the station. The conference room was thick with unease as she addressed her senior officers. "We are no longer dealing with an isolated incident," she said, her voice clipped and precise. "There are patterns here. And if we don't identify them ourselves, the public will do it for us. Riley's record is already under review. I suggest you prepare for the possibility that other names will be too." Riley, sitting at the far end of the table, bristled. "This is a witch hunt. The man's using his status to smear the department." Morales didn't blink. "Or maybe he's using his status to do what this department should have been doing all along, ensuring justice is served without prejudice." The silence that followed was telling. Back at the West Justice Initiative, Jamal began assembling a legal team specifically for Darnell's case. They reviewed body camera footage, interviewed witnesses, and discovered inconsistencies in the police timeline that made the arrest report look like a house of cards. Every new detail made the case stronger and more damning. Late one evening, Jamal visited Darnell in the county jail. The young man sat behind a scratched plexiglass barrier, his shoulders hunched, eyes wary. He looked more like a kid waiting for the principal's verdict than someone facing years' prison. "My name's Jamal West," he began. "I've read your file. I believe you were arrested without cause, and I'm here to fight that." Darnell's eyes narrowed in disbelief. "You're that guy from the news." Jamal gave a faint smile. "That's what some people say. But today, I'm just the guy making sure you get home to your family." For the first time, Darnell's posture loosened. They spoke for over an hour, about the night of the arrest, about his dreams before it happened, about how quickly the walls had closed in once the cuffs were on. By the end of it, Jamal had promised him something no one else had, that his case wouldn't be forgotten. Over the next 2 weeks, the city's conversation shifted. It was no longer just the wrongful arrest of Jamal West. It was about Darnell, and then about 2 other cases that came to light when people began contacting the West Justice Initiative with eerily similar stories. Each one was a crack in the facade of a system that had operated unchallenged for too long. One evening, as Jamal and Marcus prepared for a televised panel discussion, Angela stopped him at the door. "You know where this is going, don't you?" she asked. "Yes," Jamal said without hesitation. "This won't just be about one officer or one department. Once you start, there's no putting the lid back on." Jamal looked at her, his voice steady. "Good, because that's the point." And with that, he stepped into the waiting car, ready to turn one man's arrest into a movement the city and the nation could no longer ignore, her gaze sweeping from Riley to the window beyond. "Officer Riley, you are officially on administrative leave pending investigation. Jenkins, you'll be giving a statement this evening. Don't leave the building until then." The chief's voice was calm, but the weight in it was unmistakable. Something irreversible had begun. As Jamal made his way down the steps, shaking hands, listening to stories from people who had been through similar experiences, the late afternoon light caught the faint red marks still on his wrists. They were already fading, but Jamal knew they would not disappear from memory. He would make sure of it. Because this was no longer about a man in a suit being cuffed on a city sidewalk. This was about the system itself, and whether it was willing to face what it had become, the bigger picture. The morning after Jamal's release, the city seemed to breathe differently. The headlines were everywhere. On the front page of the Metro Times, plastered across national news websites, clipped into trending posts on every social media platform. Photos of him standing on the station steps, speaking with an unshakable calm beside his mother, had become a symbol. Civil rights leaders were already calling it a watershed moment, while political pundits tried to decide whether the department would try to contain the damage or ride out the storm. But Jamal had no intention of letting the story fade into the background. For him, this was never about a single injustice. It was about the countless injustices hidden under the weight of routine arrests and forgotten names. That morning, he sat at the long oak table in his office at the West Justice Initiative headquarters, a tall stack of case files spread in front of him. Marcus was there too, his camera resting on the table, not rolling for once. Angela poured coffee for both of them, her hands steady despite the whirlwind of the last 24 hours. The building hummed quietly, phones ringing in the distance, paralegals moving through the hallways, the smell of fresh paper and ink in the air. "There's someone we need to talk about," Jamal said, sliding a thick manila folder across the table toward Marcus. "Darnell Carter, 19 years old, arrested 3 weeks ago for armed robbery. No weapon was ever recovered. No eyewitness willing to confirm their ID in court, still sitting in county jail because his family can't post bail." Marcus flipped through the file, scanning the arrest report. "Same precinct?" Jamal nodded. "Same vague description excuse, same lack of probable cause, and get this, Riley was one of the arresting officers." Angela's lips pressed into a thin line. "They're running the same playbook," she said quietly. Jamal leaned back, folding his arms. "Darnell doesn't have a platform. He doesn't have media showing up outside the station. If no one steps in, he'll sit there until they scare him into a plea deal. That's what happens every day to people without the means to fight back." Marcus set the file down. "So we make this public." "Not just public," Jamal replied. "We make it part of the investigation. If the department wants to prove they're serious about accountability, they can start by revisiting cases like Darnell's. And if they won't, then we show the city exactly why." She knew exactly what it would mean if he walked out that door with his story unchallenged. "You understand what's happening outside, don't you?" she asked, her voice even. "I do," Jamal replied. "I also understand that what's happening outside isn't about me. Not really. It's about every man and woman who's been in this chair without the means to fight back. The only difference is I have the platform to make people listen." Morales's eyes didn't waver. "If I release you now, this is going to turn into a war in the press. My officers will be dragged through the mud. The department will take a hit that may never heal." Jamal's reply was calm, deliberate. "Chief, your department isn't under attack because of my release. It's under attack because of what happened before you even knew my name. You can't fix that by keeping me here." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Morales leaned back, exhaling through her nose. "You'll be released within the hour," she said. "No charges. But I can't control what happens once you walk out those doors." "I wouldn't ask you to," Jamal said, standing. "What happens next is exactly what needs to happen." When he emerged from the station, the crowd erupted in a swell of camera flashes and shouted questions. Angela was there, a steady presence beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Marcus stood near the steps, already holding a microphone, the red recording light on his camera blinking steadily. Jamal didn't move toward the cars waiting at the curb. Instead, he stopped halfway down the steps, turned to face the crowd, and raised his voice just enough to cut through the noise. "My name is Jamal West," he began, his tone firm but measured. "This morning, I was arrested without cause. I was told I matched a vague description of a suspect. No evidence was presented to me. No charges were explained to me. I was denied my right to a phone call until an officer intervened. I am not here to speak only for myself. I am here because what happened to me today has happened to countless others whose names you will never know, and many of them are still sitting in cells right now without anyone here to hear their story." The murmurs in the crowd deepened, cameras tilting upward to capture every word. Jamal continued, "I am the founder of the West Justice Initiative. For over a decade, I have fought to free the innocent, to challenge systemic failures, and to ensure that justice is not a privilege for the few, but a right for all. Today, I found myself on the other side of the table, not because I broke the law, but because bias still clouds the vision of those sworn to protect and serve. This is not an isolated incident. This is a pattern, and patterns demand change." Angela stood silently beside him, her gaze steady, a silent pillar of strength. "I am calling for a full, independent investigation into this morning's arrest," Jamal said, his voice gaining momentum. "I am calling for transparency in the procedures that led to it, and I am calling for accountability where it is due. I will not settle quietly. I will not accept a private apology in exchange for public silence. If this can happen to me, a man with resources, a man known to the law, imagine what happens to those without the ability to fight back. That stops here. That stops now." The crowd erupted in cheers, the sound rolling through the street like a wave. Marcus stepped forward, asking the first question, but before Jamal could answer, a chant began to rise from the activists in the crowd. "Justice for all, justice for all." It spread quickly, picked up by strangers who moments ago had been just curious onlookers. Back inside the station, Riley stood at the window, watching the scene with a mix of disbelief and seething resentment. "He's making me the villain," he muttered. Jenkins, standing a few feet away, didn't look at him. "You did that yourself." Morales stepped into the room. Jenkins sat at the far end of the table, hands clasped loosely, gaze fixed on the floor. "It was a suit, Riley. A suit and a skin color. You know that's not enough." Riley shot him a look sharp enough to slice. "You think you're better than me, Jenkins? You think I don't know what I saw?" Jenkins's voice didn't rise, but it didn't waver either. "I think you didn't see him. You saw what you wanted to see." The words hung between them, heavy and uninvited. Riley's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. By early afternoon, the first headlines began appearing online. "Man in suit arrested without charge. Video sparks outrage." "Who is Jamal West? Footage of questionable arrest goes viral." And then, the tipping point. A journalist from a national outlet pieced together the connection. Jamal West wasn't just any man. He was the founder of the West Justice Initiative, a nonprofit legal organization that had overturned over 300 wrongful convictions across the country. He had argued cases before federal courts, testified before Congress on criminal justice reform, and advised multiple states on police accountability measures. He was a Harvard Law graduate, a recipient of National Humanitarian Awards, and a man whose life's work was to dismantle the very kind of bias that had just led to his own arrest. The revelation hit the station like a shockwave. Officers passing in the hallway glanced at each other with expressions caught between discomfort and dread. A few pulled out their phones, scrolling through the story with a growing sense that this was no longer a small, containable incident. In the lobby, Angela sat beside her son as he fielded another round of questions from the press. She didn't speak, but the faint smile on her face said everything. They had tried to reduce him to just another suspect, and now the truth was flooding into the light. Inside her office, Chief Morales put down her pen and leaned back in her chair. If the world was about to demand answers, she would rather be the one asking the questions first, starting with Riley. And outside, on the steps of the station, Jamal could feel it. The shift from silence to scrutiny, from a quiet arrest to a public reckoning. The name Jamal West was no longer just the name of a man in custody. It was becoming a headline, a rallying cry, and perhaps the start of something the department could no longer control. The reckoning begins. By the time the afternoon sun slid low enough to cast the station in deep gold-tinged shadows, the story had already outgrown the building's brick and glass walls. The footage of Jamal's arrest had spread like wildfire, leaping from local feeds to national platforms, accompanied by side-by-side images of the man in handcuffs and the man in courtrooms across America standing before judges, defending the wrongly accused. Comment sections churned with outrage. Legal experts weighed in on news segments, and civil rights organizations began releasing statements demanding an investigation. The street outside the station, which had been sparsely dotted with onlookers earlier, was now a tight press of bodies. Reporters with microphones, activists with hand-painted signs, ordinary citizens drawn by the gravity of something that felt bigger than one man's arrest. Inside, Jamal sat in the small interview room Morales had moved him to after the media began gathering. The cuffs were gone, replaced by the quiet freedom of being able to rest his hands on the table, but the door was still closed, and the knowledge that the department technically still held the power to keep him here was not lost on him. Across from him, Morales leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, studying him the way one studies an unpredictable storm. She had read his file by now. Not the criminal record he didn't have, but the resume that spoke of a lifetime of fighting for justice, the unmasking. The air outside the station was cooler than it had been that morning, the clouds thickening in a slow crawl across the sky, as if the day itself had grown uneasy. Jamal stepped through the glass double doors with his mother by his side, his wrists now free, though the faint marks from the cuffs still ringed his skin. Chief Morales had allowed him to leave the holding area, but she'd made it clear they still needed to sort through the details before he could walk away entirely. It wasn't freedom yet, just a pause in the machinery of the system. One Jamal knew could snap back into motion at any moment if someone inside decided to force the matter. But the pause had created an opening, and in that opening, the world was beginning to take notice. Across the street, a small group had gathered, drawn by the murmur of something happening. Phones were raised, some snapping pictures, others live streaming. At the front of the crowd stood a man in a navy blazer, holding a camera in one hand and a microphone in the other. His eyes locked onto Jamal instantly, widening in recognition before narrowing into the sharp focus of a professional scenting a story. "Jamal," he called out, stepping off the curb. "It's Marcus Hill." Jamal's lips curled into the faintest smile. "Marcus," he said, shaking his head in quiet disbelief. "I should have known you'd find your way here." Marcus, a journalist with a reputation for digging into stories others avoided, was not just any reporter. He was one of Jamal's oldest friends, someone who had shared countless late-night conversations about justice, power, and the long road of change. The last time they'd seen each other in person had been months ago, at a community forum where Jamal had delivered a speech that had rippled far beyond the room. "I saw the video," Marcus said, his voice low but urgent. "It's already making in the rounds online. People are asking questions, and once they find out..." He stopped himself, glancing at Angela. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Jamal replied. "But you're right. People are going to find out." They didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, Marcus's voice recorder was running, and questions started flying from others who had arrived. Local reporters, freelance bloggers, even a few national stringers who happened to be in the city. "Mr. West, were you given a reason for your arrest?" Did the officers show you any evidence? How do you respond to the claim that you match the description of a suspect? Jamal answered each one with calm precision, his words measured, deliberate. He didn't shout, didn't posture, didn't use the moment to rail against the system. Instead, he let the facts speak. That he had been walking to his car after breakfast, that no clear charges had been presented, that he had been denied his phone call until an officer intervened. What he didn't mention, not yet, was his own position, who he really was beyond the man in the gray suit. That revelation would come soon enough, and when it did, it would change the weight of every detail already floating through the air. Back inside, the shift in atmosphere was palpable. Chief Morales sat in her office, watching a muted replay of the footage on a local news feed, her eyes narrowing as she studied the expressions on Riley and Jenkins' faces. The arrest had looked bad enough on the sidewalk, but in the era of instant sharing and replay, bad moments became public trials in hours, sometimes minutes. Morales knew the danger, not just to public trust, but to the legitimacy of her own command. She had worked decades to build a reputation for fairness, to fight corruption from within, and now this incident threatened to undo more than just one day's work. Down the hall, Riley was pausing in the break room, the coffee in his cup untouched. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to no one in particular. "He was a match. That's what we go on. We're in the middle of processing him. You'll have to wait until—" The click of heels on the tile floor cut through his sentence. From the inner hallway, Chief Elena Morales appeared, her dark hair pulled back into a neat bun, her tailored suit immaculate despite the long hours she had likely already put in. She was in her late 50s, and while she carried herself with authority, there was none of Riley's rigid defensiveness in her posture. Her gaze moved between Angela and Riley, and even before she spoke, the shift in the air was palpable. "What's going on here?" Morales asked, her voice even but commanding. "This is the mother of the suspect we brought in earlier," Riley explained quickly. "She's insisting on seeing him before—" "Before what?" Morales cut in, her brow arching. "Before you've even established probable cause?" She turned to Angela. "Mrs. West, I'm Chief Morales. Come with me, please." The relief on Angela's face was subtle, a soft exhale rather than an overt smile, but her nod was gracious. She followed the chief without another glance at Riley, who stood frozen in the lobby, jaw tightening. They walked down a series of corridors, the muted sound of ringing phones and distant voices filtering through the walls. Morales spoke without looking back. "I saw the video," she said. Angela's steps didn't falter. "And what did you see?" Morales's tone was careful. "I saw a man in a suit, unarmed, calm, showing no signs of resisting, being arrested on what appeared to be a very vague description. I also saw the faces of the officers involved. One looked uncertain, the other didn't." They stopped at the door to the holding room. Morales opened it herself. Inside, Jamal sat on the bench, posture straight, hands resting loosely in his lap. His expression shifted only slightly when he saw his mother, but his eyes softened in a way that could not be he. "Hidden." "Mom," he said quietly. Angela crossed the room and placed her hands gently on his shoulders, scanning him from head to toe, as though confirming he was physically unharmed. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice low enough to keep it between them. "I'm fine," he assured her. "Just another day in America." Her lips pressed into a thin line. She turned to Morales. "What are the charges?" Morales shook her head. "There's no formal charge yet. Officer Riley claims he matches a witness description in a theft case, but the details are lacking." Jamal gave a faint, humorless smile. "Vague enough to apply to half the men in the city." Angela glanced at him, then back at the chief. "Release him." Morales's jaw shifted, as if weighing the politics of the moment. "I'm not in the business of overstepping investigations, Mrs. West, but I will say this. I don't believe we have grounds to hold him, and I don't appreciate my officers making arrests that invite the kind of public attention this one already has." That was the first time Riley's name wasn't spoken, but it hung unspoken between them. Morales stepped into the hallway and called for Jenkins. When the younger officer appeared, she gave him a level look. Escort Mr. West to the processing desk. Remove the cuffs. Now. As Jenkins unlocked the steel around his wrists, Jamal's gaze met his. For the briefest moment, something passed between them. An unspoken acknowledgement that Jenkins knew this wasn't right, but had lacked the courage to stand against it. Jamal filed that away. Outside, the station's quiet murmur was shifting toward a buzz. People had started sharing the arrest video online. It was being replayed, slowed down, scrutinized. And with every view, the narrative was shifting, not toward a suspect caught, but toward a man wrongfully taken. By the time Angela and Jamal walked out of that holding, G-Room Chief Morales already knew. Whatever else happened, this was no longer a simple matter of paperwork and protocol. This was about to become something much bigger. How records could be altered, how a person could be made invisible for just long enough to break them. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. In such rooms, time bent unnaturally. Eventually, Riley opened the door, standing with his arms crossed. "We'll get to your call later," he said, as if it were a favor he might grant when it suited him. Jamal met his eyes calmly. "You're required to allow me one call now," he said, his tone still polite, but carrying the edge of someone who knew exactly what the law demanded. Riley's expression flickered, but he didn't move. Instead, Jenkins stepped forward slightly from behind him. "Let him make the call, Riley," Jenkins said quietly. His voice was low, but it carried in the confined space. Riley shot him a look sharp enough to cut, but after a tense pause, he stepped aside. The phone was an old corded unit mounted on the wall in a narrow corridor. Jamal lifted it, dialing from memory. His mother's voice answered on the second ring, warm and instantly concerned. "Jamal? Are you all right?" she asked, hearing the strain he tried to mask. "I'm fine, Mom," he said softly. "I'm at the station. I'll explain when you get here." There was no panic in her reply, only steel. "I'm on my way," she said, and hung up. When Jamal replaced the receiver, he saw Jenkins watching him. Not like a guard watching a prisoner, but like a man realizing there was more to the situation than he'd been told. That unspoken shift hung in the air as Riley led Jamal back to the holding room. Somewhere deep in the station, phones rang, papers shuffled, the normal machinery of bureaucracy grinding on. But something had already begun to change. By the time Angela West walked through those station doors, the quiet undercurrent of tension would turn into something no one in that building was prepared for. The first signs of trouble, the front doors of the station swung open with a measured push, the kind of entrance that carried no rush but left no doubt it was deliberate. Angela West stepped inside, her presence drawing the quiet attention of every officer in the lobby. She wasn't a tall woman, nor did she wear anything flashy. Just a simple navy blue dress with a modest pearl necklace and a beige cardigan draped neatly over her shoulders. But there was a certain weight to her composure, the kind that made people instinctively lower their voices and take note. Her hair, silvered with the grace of age, was pinned neatly back, and her eyes, warm brown but with a steel core, scanned the room without hesitation. She looked like someone who had spent a lifetime in classrooms guiding students, someone who could be kind when it was earned and unflinchingly firm when it was needed. Behind the front desk, a young officer straightened in his chair. "Ma'am, can I help you?" he asked. "I'm here to see my son, Jamal West," she said calmly, placing her handbag on the counter. There was no tremor in her voice, only an unwavering clarity. The officer hesitated. "I'm not sure if visitors are—" Angela leaned in slightly, her tone still polite but edged with precision. "He was arrested this morning without cause. I am here now. Please inform whoever is responsible that I will be speaking to him immediately." Before the young officer could stammer out another procedural excuse, the heavy glass door to the inner offices opened, and Officer Riley stepped into the lobby. His eyes narrowed slightly when he saw her, but his mouth curved into the strained approximation of a smile. "Ma'am, you can't just walk in and demand—" Angela's gaze locked on his. "Are you Officer Riley?" "I am," he replied, shoulders squaring. "Good," she said, the single word delivered like a verdict. "Then you'll understand me clearly when I tell you this. I will see my son, now." Riley shifted, unused to being spoken to in that tone by anyone outside the chain of command. "Sir, I'd like to contact my attorney," Jamal said calmly as they guided him toward the patrol car. "You can do that later," Riley replied curtly. The car door closed, sealing him inside. Through the glass, Jamal caught sight of his reflection, composed, expression steady, and of the people on the sidewalk watching. Some were frowning, some whispering, some filming. None of them knew who he was. Not yet. And Riley? Riley had no idea that the man he'd just arrested was about to change his entire career, and possibly the department, forever, processing at the station. The ride to the station was silent except for the low hum of the engine and the occasional burst of static from the police radio. Jamal sat in the back seat, his wrists resting on his lap, the handcuffs biting slightly against his skin. He gazed out the window, watching the city blur past, its rhythm unchanged by the small drama unfolding in the back of the cruiser. People sipped coffee, waited for buses, laughed into their phones, unaware that a man who had done nothing wrong was being driven away as if he were a danger to the public. In the driver's seat, Riley's grip on the wheel was rigid, eyes fixed on the road, jaw tight, the lines in his face deepening every time he glanced in the rearview mirror. Jenkins sat on the passenger side, one elbow propped against the window, stealing quick glances at Jamal as if he wanted to say something but couldn't quite find the courage. When they pulled into the station's back lot, the air felt different, heavy, stale, stripped of the sunlight and movement of the street. Jamal was led through a side entrance, the narrow hallway lined with scuffed beige walls and fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead. The scent of stale coffee and disinfectant clung to the air, mixing with something faintly metallic like old blood and rust. Riley's hand was firm on his arm as they guided him to the booking desk, where an officer behind thick glass barely looked up from his paperwork. Jamal was asked to remove his jacket and empty his pockets into a gray plastic tray. The clerk cataloged his belongings in a bored monotone: wallet, phone, keys, watch, each item disappearing into a plastic evidence bag. "Name," the booking officer droned, not looking up. "Jamal West," he replied evenly. His voice did not tremble. His posture remained steady. "Charges?" the officer asked without glancing at Jamal. Riley stepped forward. "Suspicion of involvement in a theft earlier this morning. Witness description matches." His voice was confident, even though he had nothing more than a vague profile to offer. The booking officer simply nodded and tapped away at his keyboard, entering the words into the system as if they were fact. Jamal's gaze flicked to Jenkins, who still avoided holding his eyes for more than a moment. Something about the younger officer's demeanor, the restless shifting of his weight, the tightening of his mouth, told Jamal that Jenkins wasn't entirely convinced by any of this. But doubt was useless if it stayed buried in silence. They led him to the fingerprint station. The cold, slightly greasy glass of the scanner pressed against his fingertips one by one, the machine beeping softly with each print taken. Then came the mugshot. A flash of light, a hollow click, and an image captured forever in a file that would say, "Arrested," even if he was released without charge. He could feel the weight of what that meant for ordinary people, the way a single moment in custody could shadow their lives for years, regardless of guilt. They placed him in a small holding room with pale green walls, a single metal bench bolted to the floor and no windows, the door shut with a heavy mechanical thud. Jamal sat, leaning back against the cool wall, his mind already calculating. He knew his rights, but he also knew the games that could be played, how phone calls could be delayed. The arrest. The city was already alive when Jamal West stepped out of the corner diner, the familiar ring of the doorbell above the frame jingling as he pushed it open. The morning light was warm but not yet harsh, spilling across the sidewalk in long, slanted rays that cut between the tall glass and steel buildings. Somewhere in the distance, a delivery truck rattled over a pothole. The scent of roasted coffee beans clung to the air, mingling with the faint, sweet smell of a nearby bakery. Jamal adjusted the cuffs of his crisp white shirt, smoothing them under the sleeves of his charcoal gray suit jacket. His tie was perfectly knotted, not in a flashy way, but with the precision of someone who understood that presentation was an unspoken language. The polished leather of his shoes clicked against the concrete as he walked, each step measured, unhurried. He had learned long ago that in a city that moved at lightning speed, there was power in walking as though you had all the time in the world. The diner staff had waved him out with the same warmth they always did. "See you soon, Mr. West," the hostess had said with a smile, and he'd returned the gesture with a nod. He wasn't a celebrity here, just a regular who ordered scrambled eggs, turkey bacon, and fruit every Thursday morning. But there was a certain respect he carried with him, the kind that came not from status, but from a quiet steadiness that people instinctively trusted. He reached into his pocket, feeling the familiar buzz of his phone. It was a text from his mother. "Dinner tonight, 7 o'clock. Don't be late." He smiled, the kind of smile that warmed his eyes, and quickly typed back, "Wouldn't miss it for the world." Family meant everything to him, even in the busiest weeks, even when deadlines stacked and travel pulled him in every direction. Thursday dinners with his mother were non-negotiable. He approached. His car, a sleek black sedan, parked neatly along the curb, and pressed the unlock button on his key fob. Just as he reached for the door handle, he noticed movement in his peripheral vision. 2 uniformed police officers were walking toward him from across the street. One was tall, with a jaw set so tightly it looked carved from stone. The other was younger, a little less certain in his stride, but still wearing the stiff posture of someone trying to project authority. Their eyes were locked on him. Jamal straightened slightly, not out of fear, but out of the awareness that had been stitched into him since childhood. His father's voice came back to him. Calm, firm, cautionary. "Always keep your hands where they can see them. Speak clearly. Stay composed. Never give them a reason." "Sir," the older officer called out, his voice carrying across the hum of traffic. "Step away from the vehicle." Jamal paused, turning slowly to face them. "Is there a problem, officer?" His tone was even, polite. The two closed the distance between them. The younger one, Jenkins, according to the nameplate, avoided direct eye contact. The older one, Riley, didn't blink. "You match the description of a suspect we're looking for," Riley said. Jamal tilted his head slightly. "A suspect?" "That's right," Riley continued. "Tall black male, gray suit, seen in this area earlier this morning." Jamal's brow lifted just slightly, the faintest flicker of disbelief passing over his face. "That description could fit a lot of people," he said. "What's the alleged crime?" Riley's jaw flexed. "We'll discuss that down at the station." There it was, the pivot point. Jamal felt it, the subtle tightening of the air. Around them, the sidewalk continued to flow with pedestrians, but a few slowed their steps, sensing tension. One young woman pulled out her phone, holding it low but angled toward the scene. "Officer," Jamal said, his voice measured, "I'm sure we can clear this up without—" "Turn around, hands on the car," Riley interrupted.